Today I am going to mount 3 different kinds of watercolor paper on a few different boards and panels that I have with some Holbein Gel Medium soft body. So I've gotten a couple different kinds of panels. These are some birch panels. So I have a Apollon Gotrick panel, 11 by 14. I also have the Da Vinci Pro panel with an 8 by 10. And then I have the Alumacomp 8 by 10 aluminum brushed panel. So I'm going to use Kilimanjaro paper, Arches paper, and Fabriano, and I'm going to mount them with my gel medium, and I'm going to see how they turn out. So I'm mounting an unfinished piece of paper onto the panel, and then I'll paint on it once it's mounted. I want to see how different the paper reacts once they're on the panel if I've mounted it first. I'm going to put my soft body gel medium onto my panel. I've got one of these little foam brushes that I'm just spreading it around with. Now the watercolor paper that I'm going to use is much larger than my panel. I've done that on purpose because I want to be able to trim down the edges right up to my panel when I'm done. So this way I have enough edge so I don't have to worry about that gel medium going over the edge of my paper and coming on the front side, because of course if you get any gel medium on the front of the paper, you will not be able to watercolor on it because it will essentially be sealed. So I know that my paper is much bigger than my panel. I've got a nice thin coat on that panel. I want to make sure that when it dries, it's going to be, a hardened layer. So I want to make sure that it doesn't have any lumps and bumps, and I want to make sure that it's all on there nice and even. So I'll put some of my excess on my paper. Get that nice and smooth on my panel. Make sure I don't have any globs going over the edges. Now I'm going to let that dry completely on my panel before moving on. So I have my panel all set. Now I'm going to put that same gel medium on the back of my watercolor paper. So I've got that on there, and I'm just spreading around, making sure to do a nice super thin layer. Now I know that I have so much extra paper on the edges, so I don't have to be quite as careful about making sure that the gel medium is right up to the edge. So I find that a little bit easier so that I don't have to be quite as careful with it. So I know that my panel is this big on my paper, so I'm going to have my gel medium go past the edge of that, but not so far to the edge of my paper that I could get it around and on the front, so that it'll be much easier to keep that surface clean. So I've got a nice even layer on my watercolor paper, and then I will let that completely dry before putting my third layer on and attaching the two together. Now that I have my gel medium soft body on all of my papers and boards, I've let them all dry, and now I'm ready to put that third layer on and sandwich them together. What I have noticed is that the 140-pound paper, if you can see, it is bowed just like you would do if you did wet on wet application to it. So it definitely feels like it will be harder to straighten out and get on there as nicely, whereas the 300-pound water paper is still just how it always is, nice and flat, and a really easy surface to work with. So first look at this, it would definitely be better to do this with the thicker paper. So I'm going to take my gel medium, and I have found that you need a lot more on the paper, obviously, because it absorbs in quite a bit, and you need a lot less on the boards, and especially even less when you're doing this third coat, because you're just putting a super thin coat on top of the dried coat that you already have on, and it is not absorbing in at all. It's just going right on top of that. So when you're putting your gel medium on, as you're pouring it on, you can think about that you definitely don't need nearly as much once you already have that acrylic coat on. So I've got my third layer onto this dried, well, second layer on this, but a layer on the paper, a layer on this that have both dried. So I have this nice flat middle layer, and I'm just going to take this. Now again, I have my paper super oversized on purpose. I'm going to push it down onto my paper, and then I'll turn my paper over. So you can see that it's pretty warped. I'm not sure if you can tell in the video, but it is like a wet watercolor paper. So I'm just going to take some parchment paper and my brayer, and I'm going to start in the center and just work my way out to the edges to make sure that any air bubbles that are trapped in there are moving out. You don't want to just randomly brayer back and forth, because of course it'll just move the air around and not get it out from under the paper. So I'll just go across the whole surface. Make sure all those air bubbles are pushed out, and that because that paper was wet, that it is laying nice and smooth. So I am noticing where the paper was wet. You know, it is pulling up in some areas, so I have brayered it, but that 140-pound paper really just isn't adhering as well as I would like. So I am going to just, at this point, turn it over, make sure it's nice and flat, and I'll put something really heavy on the back of this and let it completely dry. So just like if you have a wet watercolor paper, once it dries, it will flatten out, and we'll see how that comes out. And I'm going to do the same with my other types of boards I have and the other paper, and we'll see which one I like the best. So yesterday I used my soft body gel medium from Holbein to bind a couple pieces of watercolor paper to different style boards. I let them dry, and then I simply took an X-Acto knife, turned them over, trimmed right up to the edges, and now I have some boards mounted with watercolor paper that are all set as panels to paint on. So I can't wait to paint on these today and see how they work. The 300-pound papers worked great. They're perfectly flat, they're evenly sealed. They really worked out nicely on both the aluminum board and the birch board that's like a little frame board that I had. They both sealed completely, nice and flat. I was perfectly happy with how they trim along the outside. I liked everything about mounting those. They were super easy to do. The 140-pound that I did have some trouble with buckling. I'm not sure if you can see that in the video, but it is not adhered in a couple small places, and it was because I had trouble with the paper being wavy after I put the gel medium on it and it was wet, almost like a wet into wet watercolor. So I did have trouble getting that to bind all the way down flat. Again, this was my first time doing this, so I might have just needed to let it dry further before trying to bind it down, so that it was completely flat. But this is the one that I did of the finished painting. So I have the finished painting. My painting is just slightly larger than my panel, and I would just wanted to show you, all I did is take my X-Acto knife and went right up to the edge and just cut across. Super simple, just trimmed that extra paper. So then you just have your little extra paper, and you have your finished painting mounted to your panel. When I was drying my gel medium to bind it to the board, I put it on my papers, and then I put it down on some parchment paper face down, and then put some weight on top of it overnight. One thing that I did notice is because of the moisture of the gel medium between the table and the aluminum panel, there was no place for it to go. So you can see that this has some ripples in it from my gel medium drying and keeping it wet overnight. So I'm not sure if you can see the sheen on my painting, but some of those lines transferred to my black. So you can see a few lines in my paint from the moisture on that. So making the panels ahead of time, I wouldn't have to deal with that. Or I just have to come up with a different way to put something under them, but that is one thing that I noticed. I'm not sure if you can see it in the video, but there are some marks going through that dark paint. Nowhere else on the painting do I see anything. It really is in just that super black area that I can see those marks. Not sure if you can see them on there, but that is the only thing I noticed. I would have to touch that up before I varnished. So thanks for joining me with mounting with some soft body gel medium. And next I will be varnishing with some of Golden's Gloss Archival Varnish and Satin Varnish to see how that comes out on these panels I've made.